What's up, everybody? Peter X Distal Coffer here. Welcome to another episode of All Things Music. So today we're going to look at EDM, electronic dance music, and specifically house and techno. And I heard people refer to house and techno as cousins. I will call them not identical twins, but fraternal twins because they come out of they're very much like disco and funk, and that they're related. And essentially, house came out of disco, and techno was more uh, rooted in funk. So yeah, disco and funk are still going strong. So sort of the godfather of house. We're going to start with house because it precedes. Um, Techno a little. So house started in the late 70s. The godfather is Frankie Knuckles, and Frankie started off playing um, DJing in New York City very early in the 70s. So he was there, before, when disco was in the clubs in the early 70s and before it bubbled out and hit mainstream. So so he was there doing that, and then in the late 70s. Went back to Chicago and started DJing in the warehouse. And so the warehouse was the club. I mean, that's where um, uh, the first house parties and the experimentation happened. And so the warehouse was open from the late 70s to the early 80s. Um, and so yeah, Frankie Knuckles started in the Loft in New York City. So, you can still uh, go on Spotify and hear Frankie Knuckles, some of uh, his mixes and stuff like that. But I believe Frankie passed on, but he's really considered the Godfather. Yep. So I did a quick check. Frankie Knuckles did pass away in 2014, but man, he spearheaded a great genre of music. So thank you, Frankie, in heaven for that. So once the warehouse closed, there was the power plant, and the music box became the new clubs. And Ron Hardy was a DJ out of the music box, and he was another important figure early on in house. He was very experimental. I believe he's the first one to kind of introduce acid house, which we'll get to later. But Acid House, if you go on Spotify and uh, listen to an Acid House uh, list, what do you call those? Curated list, um, playlist. You know, Acid House sits in both funk and or techno and house. So a beautiful marriage there. And I think it was in the early to mid '80s when Acid House emerged. Um, so Your Love by Jamie Principle is one of the first big house songs. Another early big house song was On and On, which was first done in 1980, then it was brought back in 1984. Time to Jack by Chippy, that's another early big house song. And so what they were trying to do is take the best parts of dance records and focus on those parts. And the interesting thing is that these were not musicians; these were DJs, and so which is pretty amazing. And so the early house records, many of them were made in the bedroom with 4-track cassette recorders. And in the late '80s, early '90s, I had a 4-track Tascam Port 05, and I mean, considering the equipment that these that these folks were using. They made very good music. It was pretty primitive. And they used secondhand instruments a lot of time. But oh yeah, the bedroom, they were doing it in the bedroom. Thus the term house. That's one of the reasons why it was called house, because they weren't doing this in studios. They were doing this in the bedrooms, the basements of their house. And so um, the Roland 808, the legendary 808 that dropped in 82, and the TR and the Roland TB303, which was a baseline synthesizer, I think is technically what it was called. The 808 is, a classic and the godfather of drum machines now. But it kind of flopped when it first was released. So I think it was released in '82, and they stopped production by '84. And a lot of the house guys, snatched up a bunch of those 808s, and they were the first one to really figure out how to use them. And the folks doing techno were the first to really figure out how to do an 808. And people didn't know what to do with a TB303 baseline synthesizer. Is basically a bass synthesizer, and hey, the house and techno people figured it out. Um, so yeah, the fact the fact that a lot of the house music was made on secondhand equipment, sort of comes out of the line of punk and hip hop. I mean, it's a bare bones kind of genre. And it's interesting that the bare bones genres have lasted the longest. You know, house was a stripped down version of disco in some ways, because you didn't have all the strings until later. Well, you sort of did, because they were, I don't know what, they were probably using a lot of the Roland SH-101s, because those were pretty cheap, and those were bass. That's where the fat bass would come from, and a lot of these mimicking the disco and the funk fat bass. And again, the SH-101 was pretty cheap when it dropped in the early '80s. So that, in a nutshell, yeah, is the rise of house. Now, remember, I mean, you can jump on I-94 in Chicago and make your way to Detroit. And so techno in Detroit starts off in the early '80s, and house did influence the Detroit techno scene, but and there's always been this back and forth of influence between Detroit and Chicago. Very interesting over the years, seeing how that works. I mean, you had Motown, um, big in particularly the '60s. But you got to remember too, with Motown, a lot of at the end of the '60s, a lot of the songwriters from Motown left. So there's so the '70s for Motown was very different. Because Barry Gordy paid his songwriters on salary and did not give them songwriting credit. So when he, years later in the '90s or early 2000s, when he sells you know, the Motown catalog, that was his catalog. He kept ownership of that. You know, the the exceptions to that rule being Stevie, because I've already talked about how Stevie, when his contract was up in the '70s, went and did, his great 4 albums, Talking Book, Music of My Mind, Fulfilling This, and the other one is escaping me. But topped off with Songs in the Key of Life. But those early '70s, when Stevie had that great run, he basically did it, and it's like, here's my next 3 or 4 albums, take it or leave it. I'm gone. And wisely, Barry took it. Marvin Gaye, again, he wanted to do his own thing and write his own music. And Marvin did write most of his own music back in the '60s and wrote for others. But he's like, nah, I want control. And famously, what's going on? Barry Gordy's like, nobody wants to, this political stuff. Well, he was wrong on that. But for whatever reason, he still released it. I mean, but again, it was probably he didn't want to lose Marvin. So, I mean, it was that. You still had Norman Whitfield writing for the Temptations at the time. You did have some writers with the Jackson Five. And then the other big act was, the Commodores. And I don't know if, the Commodores wrote themselves or they had other writers. I think, I mean, it may have been a mix there. I don't know. I'll have to look into that. And eventually on my funk channel, I'm going to do Commodore's, epi- you know, episode where I, talk about, their top 10 songs, in my opinion, my favorite, now, then I'll revisit this issue of did they write their own stuff. And then later in the '70s, Rick James. So it was very different. It was a smaller lineup there in Motown. Uh, but conversely, I mean, you really Chicago had its own thing going. I mean, you had Curtis Mayfield coming, you had the Dells and the Shy-Lights, and really, when you think of soul, that started in the early '70s and kind of, it's that Chicago sound. It was interesting because I'm a big Power fan on Stars, and at first people were upset, when Tommy, Power Force got his own theme song. But I'm like, it's very Chicago, and it's like, yeah, it's very Chicago. You can hear the Shy-Lights and the Dells um, influence there, and so it was kind of Chicago's little, answer to, um, uh, little more sophisticated. They liked the strings, and then the Philly sound in the mid to late '70s. They came in and took the Chicago sound and went from a chamber orchestra to a whole damn orchestra with the strings. But yeah, and then of course you had Chess Records back in the day, and then Chicago blues and Detroit blues. So interesting relationship there. Musically, the I-94 Chicago to Detroit thing. Yeah, me. I guess that's my Gemini side. I wasn't in Virgo mode there for the last 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes, but hey, it is what it is. So one of the first big techno groups was Inner City. And, very early on, just like hip hop, um, uh, uh, the techno artists set up their own labels. Little different than the house, because I think there were some actual house labels set up in Chicago. So they went through local labels, and interestingly enough, in the late '80s, house migrates to Europe and they just lose their damn mind. And it was interesting because it was an underground thing. I mean, house was underground, here in the U.S. and in Europe, and some of the house, the technos, I think techno and house hit Europe in the late '80s at the same time. But, some artists here in the States didn't even realize how big they were in, um, in Europe. Because even though in Detroit, the technical artists set up their own labels, they had other distributors and they didn't do their own distribution in Europe. So it was interesting how that went. Um, so both house and techno, came out of the black community, and as I said earlier, di- uh, house has strong roots in disco. Um, and techno has roots in disco too via its influence, uh, by house, influencing techno. But techno's a little more into the funk than uh, So what's the difference? Both use four to the floor. Almost all the time, I think house four to the floor, and sometimes techno will stray. But the big thing I think is that four to the floor. So I mean, if you want to give an adjective to describe, houses four to the floor would be a kick drum. When you describe techno's four to the floor, it's a bass drum. They have a very, very heavy kick slash bass, heavy is like a black hole. I mean, so that's the one of the main differences is techno really slams the kick drum really hard. Other differences: house is more melodic. You're gonna find hooks in there, and it tends because of that to be more uh, commercial. There's been house songs over the years from the late 80s into the 90s, and even today on the charts that there's always somebody charting. Dua Lipa is very house slash disco. Uh, yeah, so it's more melodic. There's more singing in house. House has a lot of instrumentals, but there's more singing in it. Um, they have an interesting use of piano chords. I mean, it's really interesting. Like you have usually a pretty electronic sound, but then they bring in those piano chords, and it's really unique how house uses the piano in the music. It also has, the use of strings, not as much as disco, but, strings can be important in house. And, the vibe of house is upbeat. It's very sunny for the most part, keeping that disco vibe. Techno, I mean, I talked about the bass drum. The tempo tends to be faster, a little faster. The BPM beats per minute is higher. Um, techno can be more experimental, futuristic sci-fi sounds, industrial. I mean, this is Detroit, the Motor City, automobiles, and at times, techno can be a little darker than house. I think, techno I describe as kind of hardcore house. I mean, um, house, is can be radio friendly. I can't think of really a techno song that's, you know, was radio friendly. But techno will still burn up a dance floor. Now, I talked earlier about acid house, and where does that fit in? It sits right in between, and I think of the two of them, probably acid house might be the funkiest of the of the two, and both claim acid house. It's a TB 303, and it's manipulating the parameters, so it can get kind of nasally, and you play around with the resonance. Um, some don't like acid house when it's overdone. I love well cooked acid house. So, and then my music coming out later this year and into next year, there'll be acid house elements to it. So, that TB 303, when you start manipulating, it's a different type of vibe. It's a different type of funk, but it definitely is a very, very funky sound. And in many ways, Bernie Worrell with P Funk was famous. Now most hip hop songs, all the funk songs in the late '70s and early '80s used that fat synthesizer bass, and I'm pretty sure Bernie Worrell on Flashlight started that, with using that Moog bass line. But I mean, the Roland TB 303, I talked about the Roland 808 earlier, drum machine, but the TB 303 was a bassline synthesizer, and you know, the acid house folks took it and really ran with it and made it really funky. So the roots of, in some ways, I think, um, uh, of acid house goes back to Flashlight. The TB-303 wasn't out, but when you listen to the sound of Flashlight and the synthesizer programs and patches that Bernie Worrell was using, um, and how Wu played that. I mean, that's the baby that kind of gave birth to acid house. So yeah, love these genres, love both of them. Um, so when folks say disco's dead, or died and is slowly seen a rebirth. No, disco didn't go anywhere. It just evolved, just like funk evolved into hip hop and techno. And in some ways, techno is probably an acid house might be the closest. Even I don't because hip hop is ever evolving. So it's I mean, most of hip hop is still true to the funk roots, but hey, there's always something new cooking up and percolating in hip hop. So yeah, I've been waiting to do this. Uh, House really is the beginning of EDM, electronic dance music, but now there's all kinds of spin-offs on it. But again, coming out of disco, and earlier I did that episode. Disco's alive and well, under this brand, All Things Music. So yeah, so I've been waiting to do this. Did my research. So finally dropping this one. So thanks for coming through. Got 5 albums on the streaming services, and here on my channel, got 2 science fiction fantasy novels on Amazon, and novella, also science fiction fantasy. And just working on some new. Gonna drop some singles soon. Want to see how those fare, because they say singles is more of a singles driven, and so we'll see how. When it comes to artists who aren't on the big labels, from what everybody says, it's easier to get push and play and the streaming services with singles. So I'm not done with albums because I'm working on the album, maybe, well, I got 2 albums that are about 70 to 80% done. So the question is just when will they drop? So I'm going to do both singles and albums. But from here on out, the singles will be standalones. They won't be part albums. So we'll see how it goes. But thanks for coming through, and I'll see you next episode. Bye.